Hey guys, it's me, Mr. 250, and welcome back to Banshee's Last Cry. So, we found the killer, and locked him up, and now we're having a night alone with Grace. Nothing could go better, right? Grace sat on one bed, and I sat on the other facing her. Will you stay awake with me until the morning? Sure. We were both physically drained, but I didn't think either of us was ready to go to bed. Perfect silence. A ski lodge at night. Grace and I together. It was the moment I'd been waiting for. We have been doing pretty well so far. Let's take her hand. I can't believe Abby is really dead, Grace said softly. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just listened. Maybe we'll wake up tomorrow, and they'll tell us it was all just a show. Like some kind of murder mystery dinner they put on for the guests, only with real blood and dead people. And Abby will be there, and she'll be smiling. Do you think that might happen? There was no doubt that Abby was dead. I hadn't seen the body myself. I'd seen the body myself, and I didn't think I was ever going to forget those dead, empty eyes. Still, I knew what Grace meant. There was something so unreal about it, like an elaborate play moving towards its shocking ending. I'm scared, Max. Me too. How can someone just kill another person like that? Grace's question sounded both simple and philosophical at the same time. Naturally, I didn't have an answer. I just can't believe that someone like Mr. Buchanan is a psychotic killer. I know. I'm starting to have doubts myself. Really? So your theory was wrong after all? It's not like I think I'm wrong, but it could be that I'm missing something important. If I was wrong and the killer was someone else, what should I do? What if they kill again because of me? Just thinking about it, I found myself suddenly shaking. Max, Grace said, her voice barely a whisper. Yeah? Come closer to me. Without saying another word, I sat next to her on the bed and put my arm around her. I could feel her slender shoulders trembling ever so slightly. You won't touch her, I thought, Grace. I swore to myself that no matter what happened, I would protect her with my life. After staying that way for a while and gaining comfort from the contact, we finally felt safe for the first time in hours and fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. Isn't that nice? Uh-oh. Just based on the music alone, I'm assuming something bad happened here. When I woke up, I was lying in bed alone. My eyes felt heavy and swollen as I rubbed them and looked around. Grace was nowhere to be found. Grace? I called out nervously. No answer. I looked at my watch and it read 3:50 a.m. I listened hard, thinking that she might be in the shower but couldn't hear a thing over the high-pitched scream of the wind outside. I stood up and went towards the door. It was open. Only slightly, but definitely open. A shudder of fear went through my body. Did someone unlock the door and sneak in while we were asleep? Did they carry off Grace? No, it couldn't be. How could that happen without either of us waking up? And besides, why would they even want to keep us asleep anyway? Grace must have left for some reason of her own. Maybe she went to get something in her own room. Or maybe she went back there to take a shower. That must be it. She was being thoughtful and didn't want to wake me up. Whatever the reason, she was alone right now. I felt the first tendrils of worry grab onto me. I had to make sure she was safe. I had to find her. I didn't know if everyone else was asleep or not, but the hallway was silent as a graveyard. The lights, though, were still on. I tiptoed quietly to Grace's room and stood in front of the door. Grace! I knocked on the door and called out hesitantly. No answer. I pressed my ear against the door and listened, but all I could hear was the howling of the wind. Even if she was in the shower, I should have been able to at least hear the water. The bathroom was right next to the door in these rooms. Nearly in a panic, I grabbed the doorknob and turned. It swung open immediately. The door was unlocked. Grace, are you in here? Well, now it's really bad. Just as I called her name a second time, I heard a scream coming from downstairs. A scream, a true scream of absolute, unadulterated terror, touches some instinctual part of the people who hear it. It makes their body run cold. This was that type of scream. Something horrible had happened. Grace needed help. But even though I knew that, my body wasn't willing to cooperate. Whatever caused that blood-curdling scream wasn't something I was eager to see. At that moment, I was filled with a dread I'd never felt before. She screamed again. It was weaker this time and sounded full of grief instead of fear. The second floor was so quiet that it seemed entirely uninhabited. I was hoping everyone would come rushing out of their rooms, but it was still as a tomb. Well, who's more important here, Grace or everyone else? Let's call everybody. This might be a mistake. I can't... To tell you guys the truth, I actually don't remember exactly what happens in the story. I remember the major plot points, but I don't remember some of the details, so some of these decisions I actually don't remember. I decided to knock on the doors and call for help. Running down the hall, I stopped at nearly every door and pounded on it. Help! Anyone, wake up! The silence was like a living thing squeezing the breath from my lungs. I started to raise my voice even louder before I was struck by the horrifying thought. What if all the others had been killed? What if Grace was... I froze. There was a creaking sound from the stairs behind me. Someone was coming up to the second floor. That's when I knew... This could end up getting us killed. It had to be Grace, I hope so. It had to be Grace. Grace? Grace? I quickly spun around. Max. It was Grace. Grace, she was alive. A wave of relief poured over me. She jumped into my arms and I tried to calm her, trembling. Tell me what happened. I heard a scream. Was that you? She swallowed heavily and nodded. My aunt and uncle, they... That was enough. I knew what she was going to say, but I didn't want to admit it. There had been another attack, this time in the forest. But how could it be? More innocent lives snuffed out. This couldn't still be happening. You don't mean they... I started to ask in a dazed voice. Grace, her face buried in my chest, could only silently nod her head. But who could have... Mid-sentence, I remembered about Mr. Buchanan in the cellar. Could he have escaped from the cellar and murdered them? I have to go see what happened to the forest, I thought. I took Grace by the hand. But when I tried to go downstairs, she shook her head fiercely, trying to pull me back. No, I don't want to go back there. What kind of horrible, gruesome scene had she witnessed, I wondered to myself. Grace refused to budge, and I knew I couldn't leave her here by herself either. You don't have to go in all the way. Just come with me. I'll protect you, I promise. After my firm but gentle urging, she reluctantly agreed. There was a mop handle lying on the floor. I picked it up for lack of another weapon. Then, I remembered Buchanan. Was he still down in the cellar? From here, the cellar was closer. I decided it would be smarter to check it out before going to see the grisly scene I knew awaited for me. The cellar was open. Oh God. My stomach clenched, and I felt a wave of nausea grip me. Quickly, I rushed to Mr. and Mrs. Forrest's room. Grace suddenly stopped at the front desk. She gave my hand a light tug, as if to stop me from going further. Is this as far? She nodded. I tried to swallow, and found that my mouth was suddenly as dry as a desert. Letting go of Grace's hand, I moved into the room. The lights were still on. The kitchen and attached living room were brightly lit. It all looked normal enough. My first impression was that nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Oh, that's out of the ordinary. Then I saw Mr. Forrest. He was on the floor, with his back against the wall and his legs sprawled out in front of him. A large kitchen knife was sticking out from his stomach, and the ground around him had turned into a sea of blood. His hands were grasping the handle of the knife, as if he had tried to pull it out. Vomit rose in my throat, and I covered my mouth to hold it back as I rushed to the bathroom. The moment I opened the bathroom door, something fell towards me. It was a hand, covered in blood. The bathroom looked like a slaughterhouse. Colleen lay naked, leaning against the bathtub. Her eyes, like glass marble, stared back at me. It took a moment for me to realize that she was dead. This is what Grace saw when she let out her blood-curdling scream. Her beloved aunt, butchered like an animal. I can only imagine what a shock it must have been. Just thinking about it make my heart ache with sympathy. Poor Grace. I rushed back outside. Grace was standing there, her eyes filled with tears. So, are they... I wish I could have lied to spare her the pain. But I just closed my eyes and nodded. Huh? I thought I saw something at the far end of the hallway. A shadowy figure. What is it? I thought I saw someone. I pointed with my finger and felt a chill run down my spine. Was the killer lurking there or watching us? Was it Buchanan or someone else? I froze in place. Grace squeezed my arm so hard that it hurt. Max, I'm scared. Don't worry, just stay close. Hands sweating, I took a firmer grip on the mop handle and slowly headed towards the cellar. I thought, or imagined, I heard the sound of someone breathing close by. My heart was pounding like a drum. I arrived in front of the cellar door. It was open. Wait a minute. Who opened it? Mr. Buchanan? I called out down the dimly lit stairs. No answer. Step by frightened step, we slowly descended the stairs. Grace, directly behind me, gripped my hand with surprising strength. A single bare light bulb was the only source of light in the cold wine cellar. Illuminated by its pale glow, Buchanan was lying face down on the hard floor. His head turned completely to the side, and his eyes wide open. A pool of thick, dark liquid was spreading out in a rough circle around his head. Mr. Buchanan, too! My brain was a sea of white noise. I couldn't think clearly anymore. The dismembered body, the invisible attack in the snow, Abby's caved-in skull, and now the latest three. I have a feeling that, we may have picked the wrong guy. This had gone way beyond solving the mysteries like some detective. This was a struggle to make it until the sunrise, a fight for our very lives. If Grace and I didn't do something, we were both going to die brutal, horrible deaths. I can't take it anymore! I just can't! Grace held on to me and screamed through her tears. Her eyes were wild, the eyes of a panicked animal. Grace, get a hold of yourself. Get a hold of yourself or we're dead. Look at me. I shook her by the shoulders until I saw her eyes return to normal. Let's head upstairs for the time being. I didn't know what we were going to do when we got there, but I knew I didn't want to be near Mr. Buchanan's dead body any longer than necessary. I climbed the steps, pulling Grace behind me. I guess I need to tell the others about the new murders, I thought, and the first one I need to tell was Amber. Holding Grace's hand, I climbed the stairs and started knocking on everyone's door. Wake up! Wake up! It's an emergency! Hurry up! There was no answer from Faberge's or the Buchanan's room. Did something happen again? Turning around, I saw Tiffany hiding in the corner, staring at Grace and me. Apparently she and the other two behind her had come up to see what all the noise was. Her clothes still looked the same, so I assumed she'd been awake all night. I nodded gravely to her in reply, and, just at that moment, Amber opened her door and came out. Amber, your husband, I didn't have the heart to finish the sentence. Grace started to cry again, turning away. Our reaction was enough. All the blood drained from Amber's face, and she leaned heavily against the wall. Anxiously, I started towards her, but she waved me off with her free hand. I'm all right. My husband, where is he? In the cellar. Taking deep breaths to calm herself, Amber slowly made her way down the stairs. I had been afraid that she might pass out when she heard the news, but she looked a lot tougher. But I guess she was a lot tougher than she looked. That's suspicious, isn't it? Mr. Buchanan's dead? Tiffany asked in a whisper. Not just him. So are Mr. and Mrs. Forrest. All three dead? From behind her, I could hear the sound of the other two girls gasping. Look, it's more important than ever now that we all stay together. Could you please let Amber stay with you, at least? The girls whispered among themselves for a minute. Then Tiffany looked our way and nodded. Amber, her face drained of all emotion, walked stiffly in the direction of their room. Then I remembered that there should be one more person on the second floor. Faberge. I wondered why he hadn't come out, in fact. That's suspicious. I'm gonna go check on Faberge, I said. I walked down the hallway and stood in front of Faberge's door. I knocked on the door hard enough to wake him, in case he was sleeping. Faberge! Faberge! Are you in there? There was no answer. Taking the knob in my hand, I turned it slowly. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. Could he have gone somewhere, I wondered? But no. Upon entering, I saw that Faberge was lying as expected in bed. But why on earth would he leave the door unlocked after all this? Either he was confident that he was in no danger, or he himself was... I went to the bed and shouted close to his ear, Faberge, wake up, Faberge! But he didn't move a muscle. Max, he's not... whispered Grace. I was pretty sure I was wondering the same thing she was. Dead? Of course not. He's probably just exhausted. Nervously, I gave him a shake. Hey, Faberge! Faberge! He was stiff as a board. Why don't you check his pulse? Grace asked. Give me a break. He hasn't been touched since the attack. How could he be dead? I scoffed. But even so, I grabbed his hand that was lying above the sheets. Yeah! I shouted, startled so much that I dropped his hand. He was as cold as the snow piling up outside. Had he been killed too? I carefully put my index and middle fingers to his neck, just under his jawline to feel for a pulse. Is he dead? Grace was almost hysterical, half crying, half laughing. I stood frozen, unable to even nod my head. He had no pulse at all. For a while, we just stood there, too shocked to talk or even think. Big and powerful, Faberge was the man we had all been unconsciously depending on, if it ever came to a confrontation with the killer. For him to die like this in his bed. But wait a minute. Maybe he wasn't killed at all. Grace looked up with a curious expression on her face. What do you mean? Think about it. Faberge got hit in the head hard enough that he was knocked out. He could have easily had a brain hemorrhage or something. They can bleed pretty slowly. Over time, the blood builds up in the skull and causes pressure on the brain. Without treatment, people usually die. So, it was natural? If it was caused by the blow to the head, it's still murder, but... well, I don't see any new injuries, so... I think it's the most likely explanation. Whatever really happened, the fact remained that Faberge was dead. Still, it was possible that he died of his injuries, instead of being mysteriously murdered in his bed by some phantom killer. That was something anyway. So let's think. No, I guess he's going to explain what I was about to say. Suddenly, Grace's hand flew to her mouth in surprise. Oh my god, Max! Faberge is dead. Mr. Buchanan and Mr. and Mrs. Forrest. So that means that the one who's been attacking everyone must be... The only one left was Bobby. It was him after all? That meant he'd been faking his grief over Abby. Not to mention his anger at Mr. Buchanan too. It was all just an act? Let's see, I'm going to make the assumption here that Max didn't do it. Because we're Max. Now, you know, it's... with tricks, it could have been Max, but let's just say Max didn't do it. The only people that are left alive that could have done it are... we got Bobby, we've got Grace. Seems unlikely, but we've got Grace. We've got the girls, and we have Amber. So one of them it's got to be. Now, Bobby definitely seems like the most suspicious right now, because we had suspicions before, and we can't find him now. Grace, let's go back. Grabbing Grace's hand, we ran out of the Faberge's room and headed back to the girls' room. Ran out of Faberge's room. After we got in, we locked the door behind us. The girls were all huddled together in the corner of the room, as if to protect themselves from us. At least they didn't try to throw us out, I thought. The three girls stood in the corner of the room, as if to protect themselves from me, but they didn't look like they were going to go so far as to chase me out. I guess Grace must have convinced him that the killer was Bobby. We're the only ones left, not counting Bobby. Hearing myself say that, I almost couldn't believe it. Were all the others really dead? Could it be some kind of stupid mistake? I felt like I was watching myself in a movie. Bobby, did he kill my husband? Amber, nearly devoid of expression, seemed to be muttering mostly to herself. I think that he must have. There's no one else that could have, and we know Bobby wanted him dead, right? As I was saying that, I realized something didn't add up. Maybe Bobby was out for revenge, Grace said, suddenly looking up. Revenge? For Abby? Then who killed the Forrests? Well, it must be Bobby, right? But why would he do something so horrible to them? Maybe because Mr. Forrest had the key to the cellar. The key, that's it. Without the key, he couldn't have gotten into the cellar. So he killed the Forrests just so he could get to Buchanan? But that's insane. Yeah, it is. I mean, murdering two people that had nothing to do with it just so you can get the key, I mean, you gotta be pretty twisted. But as I thought about it, it all made sense. Mr. Buchanan murdered Mr. Jones and Abby. Then Bobby killed the Forrests, taken the key to the cellar, snuck down and killed Mr. Buchanan. If that was true, then we wouldn't be in any more danger. As long as Bobby didn't snap and start killing everything in sight, there was no reason for him to try to kill Grace, me, or the three girls. On the other hand, he killed the Forrest for the most trivial of reasons, so maybe we should just assume he had already lost his mind. I remembered the gruesome scene in their room, and felt like I might vomit again. What are we going to do now? Grace said in a faint voice, as she sat crouched at the foot of the bed. We're going to stay right here until morning. What's going to happen then? The weather will probably improve a bit. We might even be able to use the phone. Maybe. Someone will come to help. Maybe. Probably. I realized that everything I said was resting on nothing but hope. But what if neither the weather or the phone situation improves? Well, the weather has to get better sometime, and when it does, we'll be able to drive out of here. I'd never admit it to them, but I didn't think it was going to be that easy. Even if the snowstorm stopped, the roads would have to be cleared before we could drive anywhere. I didn't think we'd be able to get our cars out of the parking lot by ourselves. In fact, the cars were probably so buried in the snow that we might not even be able to find them. The others were probably thinking the same thing, because the atmosphere in the room was dark and gloomy. We were all suffering from a level of shock and fear far beyond what a normal person has to deal with. This kind of brutality and violence was usually only seen and experienced by soldiers in wartime, and we had nowhere to run. Sitting here trapped in this little room, listening to the screaming of the wind outside, we were all crushed by the sense of our impending deaths. There's no way to describe the feeling of suffocating on fear, images of being brutally murdered like the others playing across your mind's eye. Yes, murdered like the others, like Abby, like Buchanan, like Colleen and William Forrest, and even worse, like Mr. Jones. I knew that locking ourselves in the room like this was our last hope, but Bobby was out there somewhere, walking around freely. Was he watching us? Just waiting for a chance to come and kill us all? Just thinking that through my mind in a doubt, I started to think that it might be safer to run and find someplace safer. We sat there in silence for what seemed like hours, but when I glanced at the time, it was still only 5 o'clock. Amber wiped the frost off the window with her hand and looked out. It's still so dark, so it's hard to tell, but it looks the same as before. The three girls sat, exhausted, with their backs against each other. Dark circles stood out beneath their closed eyes. They looked like they might be half asleep. Grace's face, too, was a testament to what we'd been through. Puffy, swollen eyelids sat above red, bloodshot eyes, circled by dark rings of exhaustion. Her hair looked tangled and matted. I'm sure I didn't look any better. Strangely, Amber, the woman who lost her husband, looked the most normal out of all of us. They say that people oftentimes don't cry in their saddest moments, but in her case, it looked like whether she couldn't decide whether or not she was sad at all. Wait a minute. I really like this track too, by the way. extreme foreboding sense, isn't it? I deduced that Mr. Buchanan was the one that killed Abby and Mr. Jones. But if he was capable of doing it, then so was Amber. She said that she was with him in the room. Could it be that they did it together? If it were true, then if she arranged it so it looked like Bobby had killed Mr. Buchanan, she could cover the entire thing up. It would look like Bobby had committed all the murders, or he'd taken revenge on Mr. Buchanan for the first two. Yes. And that's exactly what I had thought at first. I had to fight to hide the fear that was suddenly raging inside of me. It's okay. It's okay. There's nothing to be afraid of. Unless I let my guard down, there's no way she'll be able to kill us. Besides, if I read the situation correctly, she didn't have a reason anymore. In fact, if she did, she wouldn't be able to blame the murders on anyone besides herself. I didn't know what the truth was. I didn't know what was going on, or who the real killers were. I didn't know if we were safe or if we were still in danger. Most of all, I didn't know what we should do. It was like a nightmare that you can't wake from, where you can't tell the difference between what's real or what's just in your mind. Probably the one thing that you don't want to be hearing at this time. Just then, I heard a strange noise coming from somewhere. Some kind of electric chiming sound. What was that? Grace asked anxiously. I had no idea either. It sounded like some sort of door chime. It couldn't be that, I thought. Who'd ring the doorbell of a lodge at 5 in the morning in the middle of a blizzard? Probably someone stuck outside. It didn't even seem possible. But then the chiming sound rang out again. And again. And again one more time. We all looked at each other. No, no! Debbie screamed and knelt down on the bed. Almighty Father, we humbly beseech thee, deliver your flock from evil. Shaking uncontrollably, she began to pray, repeating the same phrase over and over. Once again the chime rang out. Tiffany jumped to her feet. Someone's here! Maybe they've come to save us! She ran to the door and started to open it. I thought to myself, no one's coming to help us, it's a trap, or thank God maybe this is all over.